I wasn't planting trees. I was proving I still mattered.
Nobody picked up a shovel for Mabel Rowe. Not one person. They stood by the east fence line and watched a 69-year-old widow kneel in dry Missouri dirt, pressing the first of 340 bare root saplings into ground everyone had already given up on. Her late husband's cousin leaned against the gate. A neighbor she had known for 30 years laughed under his breath. Someone from town said she was planting a cemetery for sticks. Mabel heard them, every word. But she kept digging. Then her son Graham pulled up. For 1 second, Mabel thought he had come to stop the laughing. Instead, he looked at her muddy hands and said, "Mom, you don't start a future at your age." That was the sentence that almost made her put the shovel down. Almost. But Mabel had found something in her husband's old field notebook. Not money, not a deed. Just one line written so hard the pen had torn the paper. Plant the east line first, before they ask why. 4 years later, the first person to return to that fence was not Graham. It was the man who had laughed the loudest. Subscribe now, because when he came back, he wasn't asking about the trees. He was asking who still had the notebook. The man who came back 4 years later asking about Arthur Rowe's notebook had once stood at the same fence and laughed. His name was Earl Rowe, Arthur's cousin. The first morning Mabel planted the trees, Earl parked his old brown pickup beside the east gate and stepped out with empty hands. No shovel, no gloves, no water, just a smile that made Mabel feel like the farm was already being judged without her. She was kneeling in the dry Missouri dirt, pressing the first bare root sapling into a shallow hole. Behind her, the rest lay wrapped in wet burlap, 340. Thin stems, pale roots, nothing about them looked strong yet. Earl looked at the bundles and gave a small laugh. Arthur must have left more grief in that house than sense, he said. Mabel heard him. She did not answer. She packed soil around the first sapling with both hands. One, then she reached for the next. By mid-morning, Vern Halper slowed his tractor on the other side of the fence. Vern had borrowed tools from Arthur for years. At Arthur's funeral, he had held Mabel's hand and told her to call if she needed anything. Now he looked at the saplings and shook his head. Mabel, that edge never held much. "You'll wear yourself out planting sticks in bad dirt," Earl chuckled. Mabel pushed the shovel into the ground again. The blade hit hard soil. Her wrist jolted. She pressed her boot down and forced the metal deeper. That was how the first day began. Men watching. Men advising. Men laughing softly enough to pretend they were kind. By noon, Cal Briscoe from town had walked up with coffee in one hand and a grin he did not bother hiding. "How many did you buy?" he asked. Mabel wiped dirt from her palm. 340. Cal looked at Earl, then Vern. 340, he said. "That's not farming. That's punishment." They laughed again. Mabel kept planting. Not because it did not hurt. It did. Her knees ached before the first row was done. Her palms burned inside her gloves. Dust clung to the hem of her faded blue dress. But pain was easier to carry than the memory of Arthur's last warning. Plant the east line first. She had not understood it then. She barely understood it now. But she knew Arthur had not written those words for nothing. Then her son's truck turned in from the county road. For one brief second, Mabel's heart lifted. Graham had come. Maybe someone had told him how Earl and the others were speaking to her. Maybe he had come to stand beside his mother. Maybe just once he would remember she was not a problem to be managed. Graham stepped out. He looked at Earl, at Vern, at Cal, then at the wet burlap and the thin saplings waiting in the dirt. His face tightened. "Mom," he said, "please tell me you didn't spend real money on this." The laughter stopped for half a breath. Then it changed. It became quieter, sharper. Mabel gripped the shovel. Graham came closer, careful not to get mud on his boots. "We've got taxes coming," he said. "The barn roof is leaking. Insurance is due. And you're out here planting trees on the worst side of the farm?" Mabel looked across the east field. The soil near the fence was pale and loose. The outer rows had struggled for years. Whenever the wind crossed that side, dust lifted like the land was slowly leaving itself. To Graham it looked useless. To Mabel it looked wounded. "This side is not the worst," she said. Graham gave a tired laugh. "Dad would have told you to stop." That sentence struck harder than Earl's joke, harder than Vern's warning, harder than Cal's grin. Even Earl looked away. Mabel stood still, one hand on the shovel, the other streaked with soil. Then she looked at her son and said quietly, "No, Graham, your father is the reason I started." Nobody answered. So Mabel turned back to the ground. She planted through the rest of that day and the next. By then, word had moved through town. Mabel Rowe was planting trees. Hundreds of them. At her age. On that field, trucks slowed near the road. People looked, whispered, and drove on. Some waved like pity was a favor. Nobody helped. On the second evening, Mabel's left glove tore open. A blister split in her palm. She wrapped the shovel handle with a strip from an old feed sack and kept going until the sky turned gray. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with her hands in a bowl of cool water. Arthur's field notebook lay closed beside her. She looked at it and whispered, "I hope you knew what you were asking me to do." But the answer, if there was one, stayed hidden between the pages. On the third morning, Mabel woke before sunrise. Her back hurt, her knees burned, her fingers were stiff. For a moment, she stayed in bed and listened to the house settle around her. She could stop. Everyone expected her to. That was why she got up. She tied a scarf over her gray hair, pulled on the torn glove, and went back to the east fence line. By late afternoon, only one sapling remained. The men were there again. Earl by the gate, Vern near his tractor, Cal with his coffee, Graham standing a few steps behind them, arms folded, watching his mother finish what none of them believed would matter. Mabel carried the last sapling to the old corner post. Her arms trembled. Rain clouds gathered over the field. She dug slowly, lowered the roots, packed the soil tight. Then she stood, 340, done. Nobody clapped. Nobody apologized. Graham stepped closer and looked down the long, fragile line. "When these die," he said, "maybe you'll finally listen." Mabel picked up the shovel. "If they die," she said, "I'll plant again." For the first time, Graham had no answer. That night, the storm came hard. Rain struck the roof. Wind pushed against the kitchen windows. Somewhere outside, loose tin banged against the barn wall. Mabel woke before 2 and went downstairs. Lightning flashed. For 1 second, the east fence line appeared through the glass. The saplings bent low in the wind. One section near the corner post leaned almost flat. Mabel gripped the sink. Then the kitchen window rattled. A draft moved across the table. Arthur's notebook shifted. Mabel turned. She had left it closed. Now the cover had lifted and a folded page had slipped halfway out. She crossed the kitchen slowly, her hands still sore from planting. At the top of the page, in Arthur's handwriting, were 5 words she had never seen before. "If Earl asks, say nothing." Mabel stopped breathing. Then she saw the name written beneath it, circled twice, James Albright. Mabel stared at the name until the letters blurred. James Albright, circled twice. Beneath Arthur's warning, "If Earl asks, say nothing." Rain pressed against the kitchen windows. The old house creaked softly in the wind. On the table, Arthur's notebook lay open like it had been waiting for the storm to shake loose what Mabel had missed. She sat down slowly. Her hands still hurt from planting. A cloth strip covered the torn blister in her palm. Dirt sat beneath her nails, no matter how long she had scrubbed, but the pain faded behind one question. Why would Arthur tell her not to speak to Earl? Arthur Rowe had been a quiet man, not a secretive one. He labeled seed jars, saved receipts, wrote fence measurements on feed sacks. If a tractor part broke, he left the old piece on the workbench so he would remember what to replace. He did not hide things without reason. Mabel unfolded the page carefully. There was no hidden deed, no bank account, no dramatic confession. Only a sketch of the east fence line drawn in Arthur's steady hand. At the top he had written, "East line first, windbreak before sail talk." Mabel touched the words. They sounded like him, plain, practical, urgent without raising his voice. Beneath the sketch were marks along the fence, 10 feet apart. Some staggered, some doubled near the old corner post where the soil had always looked pale and loose. Beside the marks were tree names: hawthorn, wild plum, serviceberry, bur oak near the low drainage dip. Mabel remembered Arthur saying those names one winter evening while she dried supper plates. He had been standing by the kitchen window, rubbing a pinch of soil between his fingers over a folded newspaper. "This dirt is getting tired," he said. Mabel had smiled without looking up. "Aren't we all?" Arthur did not smile back. He looked toward the dark field beyond the glass. "No," he said, "this is different." At the time, she thought he was only worrying the way farmers worried. Too much rain, not enough rain, corn too low, hay too thin, fences leaning, prices falling. There was always something. But Arthur had not been complaining. He had been watching something disappear. The wind had been taking the east field slowly, not all at once, not in a way people could point to from the road. It lifted the lightest soil first, dried the outer rows first, left the edge weaker every season. Arthur had seen it before anyone called it a problem. Mabel turned another page. This one held measurements, fence length, spacing, survival notes, a nursery quote from outside Columbia, and one number circled hard enough to dent the paper. 340. Mabel breathed out. So it had never been a random number. Arthur had counted. He had measured. He had planned the exact line she had just planted, while Earl and the others laughed. Then she saw a sentence written near the bottom. Mabel understands patience, the boys don't. Her throat tightened. It was not a sweet sentence. That was why it hurt. Arthur had not dressed it up. He had not written that she was brave or special or stronger than anyone knew. He had simply trusted the one thing everyone else treated like weakness, her patience. For almost a year, Graham had spoken to her as if grief had emptied her mind. Lena had tried to soften every decision until it no longer sounded like Mabel's. Earl had circled the farm with advice that always ended in the same place. Sell, move on, be practical. But Arthur had written something different. He had written that Mabel would understand. She turned back to the folded page. Under James Albright's name, Arthur had written, Callaway County Extension. Ask him before signing anything. Mabel's fingers stilled. Before signing anything. She had not told Arthur about Graham's recent pressure. Arthur had been gone before the sale talk began. So why had he written that? A draft moved through the kitchen again, lifting the edge of another loose paper near the back of the notebook. Mabel pulled it free. It was a copy of an old meeting notice from the county extension office. Windbreaks, soil loss, and small farm protection. Arthur's name was written in the corner, so was James Albright's. And below them, in smaller handwriting, was another name, Earl Rowe. Mabel stared at it. Earl had been at that meeting. He had heard what Arthur heard. He had known the East Line was not foolishness. A cold thought moved through her. Maybe Earl had not laughed because he knew nothing. Maybe he laughed because he knew enough to hope she would stop. She checked the back of the paper. Arthur had written one final note there. The words were short, but they made the quiet kitchen feel suddenly unsafe. If they pushed to sell before the trees take root, ask James what Earl measured. Mabel read the sentence again. Outside, thunder rolled across the field. Inside, the old notebook sat open beneath her hands, and for the first time, the 340 saplings no longer felt like the beginning of Arthur's plan. They felt like the part someone had been waiting for her to abandon. By morning, the storm had passed, but Arthur's sentence had not. Ask James what Earl measured. Mabel read it again before sunrise, and again after coffee, not because she understood it. Because she didn't. Outside, the east field lay under a gray Missouri sky. The new saplings bent in uneven lines along the fence. Some had leaned hard in the storm. Some were still standing straight, thin as sewing needles against the dirt. Mabel wanted to check every one of them, but Arthur's notebook kept her at the kitchen table. He had not written warnings for drama. Arthur wrote things down because something needed doing, and if he had written Earl's name twice, then Earl had not simply been a man laughing by the fence. He was part of something Arthur had seen coming. A truck pulled into the yard. Mabel closed the notebook before the engine stopped. Graham stepped into the mudroom without knocking. He had started doing that a few months after Arthur died, as if the house had slowly become a problem he was responsible for. "Mornin'," he called, but his voice already had business in it. He entered the kitchen with a folder under his arm. His boots were clean. Too clean for a farm visit after rain. Mabel looked at the folder. Graham saw her looking and placed it on the table. "We need to talk about the farm." Mabel stayed by the sink. "We talked yesterday." "No," Graham said. "Yesterday you made a scene in front of half the county." The words landed softly, but not kindly. Mabel looked toward the east field. Half the county had watched her plant, but only her son had called it a scene. Graham opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, parcel lines, repair estimates, tax notes. A photograph of the farmhouse taken from the road. A photograph of the barn roof, and then a photograph of the east field before the saplings. Mabel stepped closer. "Who took these?" "Calvin Price came by last week." The name did not settle at first. Then Mabel remembered a gray SUV near the mailbox. a man in a pressed shirt, holding up a phone like he was checking messages. He had not been checking messages, he had been taking pictures. "He's with a land group out of Jefferson City," Graham said. "They make clean offers, quick closings, no drawn-out mess." Mabel looked at the Eastfield photo. Someone had outlined the weak section in yellow. Beside it were 4 typed words: reduced productivity, development discount, development, not soil, not farming, not Arthur's plan, development. Graham tapped the page. "Mom, I know you don't want to hear this, but taxes are coming. The barn roof is still leaking. Insurance is up again. You can't keep carrying this alone." Mabel lifted her eyes. "I carried it with your father for 42 years. With Dad," Graham said. "That's the difference." There it was, plain. Arthur was gone. So everyone had decided Mabel's judgment had gone with him. Before she could answer, another car rolled into the yard. Lena. She came in with a grocery bag and the careful face people wear when they have already chosen a side but want to sound gentle. "I brought soup," she said. Then she saw the folder. Mabel looked at her daughter. "You knew?" Lena set the bag down slowly. "Graham showed me some of it, enough to worry, not enough to question." Graham slid one paper toward Mabel. "The offer won't stay open forever. Calvin wants to walk the property Friday." "No." Graham blinked. "You haven't even heard him." "I heard enough from his photograph." Lena stepped closer. "Mom, we're not trying to take anything from you." Mabel looked at the yellow outline around the east field. "No. You're trying to decide what has no value before it has a chance to prove you wrong." Silence moved through the kitchen. Then Graham's eyes shifted, not to the folder, to Arthur's notebook. "What's that?" Mabel placed her hand over the cover. "Your father's field notes." Graham gave a short, tired laugh. "Dad wrote notes on everything. That doesn't mean we should run the farm from a notebook. He wrote about the East Line. That changed him. Only for a second." His mouth stayed firm, but his eyes sharpened. "What exactly did he write?" Mabel remembered the warning. "If Earl asks, say nothing," so she answered her carefully. "Enough." Graham closed the folder. "Earl said you might start bringing Dad into this." Mabel's fingers tightened on the notebook. Earl again. Not outside the matter, inside it. "When did you talk to Earl?" she asked. "Yesterday evening, after I planted." He was concerned. Concern. Mabel had begun to hate that word. It sounded soft, but it always came with hands reaching for something that belonged to her. Graham gathered the papers. "We'll give you a few days. But Calvin is coming Friday. I think you should hear him out. No one is walking this farm with sale papers until I speak to James Albright." The room changed. Not loudly. Not visibly enough for Lena to notice at first, but Graham noticed. His face went still. Then a sound came from the mudroom. A faint scrape. A wet coat brushing the doorframe. Mabel turned. Earl Rowe stood there. Raincoat damp at the shoulders, one hand on the wall. His eyes were not on Graham, not on Lena, not even on Mabel. They were on Arthur's notebook. For the first time since he had laughed at the fence, Earl did not smile. Then he spoke, low and careful.
"Mabel, who told you to call James Albright?"
Mabel looked at Graham, then at Earl, then down at the notebook beneath her hand. And in that quiet kitchen, she understood something that made the sale papers feel suddenly dangerous. They were not afraid she would lose the farm. They were afraid she would ask the right person why they wanted her to sell it now. Earl Rowe did not answer Mabel's question. He only looked at Arthur's notebook. That was enough. The kitchen felt smaller with him standing there. Graham had the folder under his arm. Lena stood near the grocery bag she had brought and never unpacked. And Mabel understood something she had not understood the night before. The sale papers were pressure. But the notebook was what made Earl nervous. "You don't need to bring county people into family business," Earl said. His voice was calm, too calm. Mabel kept one hand on Arthur's notebook. "This farm is not just family business." Earl's mouth tightened. For one quick second he looked at Graham, then away. Mabel saw it, a small look, fast, familiar. The kind people share when they have talked before everyone else enters the room. Then Earl smiled, but it came too late. "Arthur worried too much near the end," he said. Mabel felt that sentence in her chest. Not because it was loud, because it was careful. He was not only questioning the notebook, he was questioning Arthur. She lifted the notebook from the table and held it against her side. Arthur saw things before other people admitted they were there. No one answered. A gust rattled the kitchen window. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart. Mabel turned toward the east field, the saplings. For one terrible moment, she had almost forgotten them. She took her coat from the chair and walked out before anyone could stop her. The yard smelled of wet dirt and old wood. Rainwater dripped from the barn roof. The ground gave softly under her boots. At first, the tree line looked alive, bent, but alive. Then she reached the old corner post. Mabel stopped. Several saplings had leaned almost flat. Two had pulled partly from the soil. One had snapped near the base, its thin stem hanging loose in the rain-dark air. For a moment, she could not move. 3 days of pain, 3 days of laughter, 340 small promises in the ground, and the first storm had already found the weakest place. Mabel knelt in the mud, slowly. The cold soaked through her dress, but she did not stand back up. She cupped the first exposed root ball with both hands and pressed it into the earth. "Not yet," she whispered. She moved to the next, then the next. Behind her, no one came, not Graham, not Lena, not Earl. Their silence reached her across the field. It hurt, but it did not surprise her. This work had begun with empty hands watching her, so she worked with her own. At the low stretch near the corner, one sapling had washed loose completely. Mabel found it several feet away, roots muddy, leaves torn, the stem bent but not broken. She held it in both hands. It looked foolish, too small to matter, too weak to save, and for the first time since planting, doubt rose in her so sharply she had to sit back on her heels. Maybe Graham was right, maybe the trees would die. Maybe Arthur had left her a plan that needed a younger body, stronger hands, and more years than she had left. The wind moved over the field. A leaning sapling trembled beside her. Then Mabel remembered something Arthur once said after a winter calf was born weak and shaking. Weak doesn't mean finished. She wiped rain from her face. Then she stood, not quickly, not easily, but she stood. She went to the shed and found wooden stakes, old twine, and a rusted hand trowel. One by one, she braced the damaged saplings. She packed soil around exposed roots. She tied the weakest stems loosely enough to move, but firmly enough to hold. This time, she did something Arthur would have done. She wrote it down, not neatly, not beautifully, just the truth. Corner section, heavy wind. 2 pulled loose, 1 broken, soil-washed near post. She took pictures with her old phone. Her hands shook so badly the first photo blurred. She deleted it and took another, then another. Proof did not need to be pretty. It only needed to exist. By late morning, she stood beside the damaged section with mud on her knees and Arthur's warning in her mind. Ask James what Earl measured. She pulled out her phone and searched for the Callaway County Extension office. Her thumb hovered over the call button. For a few seconds, fear returned. What if James did not remember Arthur? What if he heard an old widow talking about notes, trees, and warnings? And decided grief had made her imagine things. The wind pushed softly through the new saplings. Mabel pressed call. The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered first. Mabel gave her name. There was a pause, then the line clicked. An older man's voice came through. "This is James Albright." Mabel closed her eyes. "My husband was Arthur Rowe." Silence, not empty silence, remembering silence. Then James said softly, "Arthur from the East Line meeting?" Mabel gripped the phone tighter. "Yes." Another pause. Then James asked the question that made her turn back toward the house. "Mrs. Rowe, did he leave you the notebook?" Through the kitchen window, she could see Earl still inside, still near the table, still too close to where the notebook had been. Mabel's heart knocked once. "Yes," she whispered. James's voice lowered, "Then listen carefully, put it somewhere safe, and don't let Earl Rowe know what pages you've read." Mabel looked at the leaning saplings, then at the house, then at the muddy page of notes in her own hand, and for the first time, she realized the storm had not been the real danger. The real danger was standing in her kitchen, waiting to find out how much Arthur had told her. James Albright arrived just after noon in a White County truck with mud on the tires and a clipboard on the passenger seat. He did not park by the house. He parked near the east gate. That was the first thing Mabel noticed. Most people came to the kitchen first. They wanted coffee, papers, explanations, a place to sit while they told her what she ought to do. James went straight to the field. Mabel watched from the porch as he stepped out, pulled on a brown canvas jacket, and stood facing the new tree line. He did not smile. He did not shake his head. He did not laugh. He only looked, and somehow, That was the first kindness Mabel had received all week. Before he arrived, she had hidden Arthur's original notebook inside an old flour tin in the pantry, behind jars of canned peaches and green beans. She did not know why that place felt safe. Maybe because nobody ever looked behind the things older women saved. On the kitchen table, she left only 3 copied pages, the sketch, the tree list, and James Albright's name. When Mabel reached the gate, James removed his cap. "Mrs. Rowe," he said. He did not speak loudly. He did not speak slowly. He spoke to her like she was still the owner of her own thoughts. "You remember Arthur?" Mabel asked. James looked down the fence line before answering. "I remember him asking the question nobody else wanted to ask." "What question?" James stepped past the gate and pointed toward the east field. "How much soil can a farm lose before people admit something is being stolen?" Mabel looked across the field. For 40 years, she had seen that land as work, planting, harvest, bills, weather, home. But stolen, that word made the wind feel different. James walked to the damaged stretch near the old corner post. He crouched beside one of the leaning saplings and touched the soil with 2 fingers. Then he rubbed it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. "This corner took the worst of the storm," he said. "I thought it meant the trees were failing." "No," James said. "It means Arthur marked the right place." Mabel went still. James looked up. "You planted all 340? "Yes." "Alone?" Mabel nodded. For a moment James said nothing. Then he looked at the long, uneven line of saplings and said, "That was hard work." The words were simple, but they almost undid her, not because they were grand, because they were the first honest words anyone had given her about what those 3 days had cost. James asked to see her notes. Mabel handed him the few pages she had copied, then opened the small field log she had started after the storm. The handwriting was uneven. The first photo on her phone was blurred. The descriptions were plain. 2 pulled loose, 1 broken, soil washed near post. James read every line. Not quickly, not politely, carefully. Then he said, "Keep doing this." Mabel frowned. "Writing down broken trees?" "Writing down the truth before someone else writes it for you." That made her look toward the house. James saw the look but did not press. He walked a few steps down the fence line and showed her where to take pictures each month. Same post. Same angle, same stretch of ground. He told her to mark rain dates, tree losses, replacements, wind damage, and crop condition near the edge. No long speech, no fancy terms, just proof. "Arthur understood the problem," James said. "The wind hits this side open. It dries the edge first. It lifts the light soil first. A windbreak won't fix that in 1 season. But if enough of these survive, the field starts getting protection before people even notice it." Mabel listened. Not because she understood every part, because it sounded like Arthur's patience had found another voice. Then she asked the question that had followed her since the notebook opened. "What did Earl measure?" James stopped moving, only for a second, but Mabel saw it. He looked toward the road, then back at the corner post. "Arthur measured what the wind was taking," he said. "Earl measured what a buyer could discount." The field seemed to quiet around her. James pushed a small orange flag into the mud near the damaged corner. "If someone can call this section dead land, they can lower the offer," he said. "If they buy before restoration starts, they control what happens after." Mabel looked at the flag. 1 small strip of orange against wet brown soil. It looked harmless, but it felt like a warning. "So Earl knew the east line mattered," she said. James answered carefully. He knew enough to know Arthur wasn't guessing. The words settled heavy, not enough to accuse, enough to fear. James handed her a blank field log from his clipboard. "You don't have to prove everyone wrong today," he said. "Just keep better records than they expect." Mabel held the log against her chest. Then a truck door closed behind them. Graham stood near the gate. He had come quietly, too quietly. His eyes moved from James to the orange flag to the papers in Mabel's hand. "What's this?" he asked. James turned. "Field documentation. For trees? For land," James said. Graham stared at the damaged corner, then at the orange flag. The color seemed to bother him more than the words. James looked back at Mabel. "I'll come again in 2 weeks," he said. "Until then, don't sign anything tied to this field." Graham's face went still. "Sign what?" he asked. Mabel did not answer. She was watching his eyes. Because Graham was no longer looking confused. He was looking at the corner post, the exact corner Arthur had marked, the exact corner James had flagged. Then Graham said something that made Mabel's hand tighten around the field log. "Why did you mark that spot?" James said nothing, Mabel said nothing, and in the silence that followed, Mabel realized Graham had just asked a question he should not have known to ask. Graham should not have known about the corner post. That was the thought Mabel carried back to the house. Not in panic, not yet, but it sat in her chest like a small stone. James had placed one orange flag beside one damaged stretch of the east fence line. To anyone else, it was just a wet corner after a storm. But Graham had looked at it and asked why that spot was marked. Not what the flag was, not who placed it. Why that spot? Mabel said nothing. Some questions were better saved until people believed you had stopped listening. By Friday morning, the farm had dried under 2 clear days of wind. The saplings still leaned in places, but the worst section had held after she restaked it. Mabel took pictures from the same fence post, just as James told her, same angle, same date, same damaged corner. Then she wrote it all down in the field log, plain words, no decoration, but every line felt like a small fence around the truth. At 10 o'clock, a gray SUV turned into the yard. Calvin Price stepped out first, polished boots, pressed shirt, folder in hand, a smile that looked practiced in front of widows, heirs, and people tired enough to sign things. Graham arrived behind him, then Earl. That was when Mabel understood. This meeting had been arranged before she was ever asked. Calvin greeted her on the porch. "Mrs. Rowe, I appreciate you hearing us out." Mabel looked past him at Graham and Earl. "I haven't agreed to anything." "Of course," Calvin said. "Today is only a conversation." But people did not bring maps to a conversation unless they already knew where they wanted it to end. Inside the kitchen, Calvin laid the papers on the table, a property map, a tax sheet, repair estimate, and a photograph of the east field taken before the trees were planted. Mabel looked at it. The field looked pale in the picture. Empty, weak, like something already defeated. Someone had outlined the east side in yellow. Beside it were 4 typed words: reduced productivity, development discount. Mabel did not touch the paper. She only stared at those words. Development discount. That was what they called Arthur's warning. That was what they called the soil he had spent years watching. Calvin spoke gently. The east field creates some difficulty for valuation. Exposure issues, soil loss near the fence. Any buyer will see that section as a liability. Mabel looked up. "You took this picture before the trees were planted." Calvin's smile held. "The trees don't change the current condition." "Current," Mabel repeated. One word, but it made Calvin's eyes sharpen. Graham stepped in quickly. "Mom, nobody is saying the trees don't matter to you." To you. There it was again, the little box they kept trying to place her in. If the trees mattered only to Mabel, then they were grief. If they were grief, they could be dismissed. But if they mattered to the land, then every paper on that table was missing the most important part of the story. Mabel leaned over the map. Near the east corner post, she saw a small mark. Her breath slowed. It was not orange like James's flag. It was black ink. But it pointed to the same place, the same damaged corner, the same weak stretch Arthur's had circled. Mabel placed one finger beside it. "What is this mark?" Calvin glanced down. Survey reference. "For what?" "General assessment." Mabel waited. Calvin's smile thinned. "Nothing unusual." Earl spoke from the doorway. "Mabel, don't make this bigger than it is." She turned to him. He had said almost the same thing before. "Do not bring county people into family business. Do not make it bigger. Do not ask. Do not look. Do not dig." Mabel closed the folder halfway. "I'm not signing." Graham exhaled hard. "Mom, no." Calvin did not look surprised. That worried her more than anger would have. He simply nodded and said, "Take the weekend. We can revisit this Monday." Then his eyes moved to the field log near the sugar bowl, just for a second, but Mabel saw it, so did Earl. Calvin pointed politely. "Are those your planting notes?" Mabel reached for the log before his hand moved another inch. "Yes, that kind of record can be useful," Calvin said, "for your own memory." "For the field," Mabel said. The kitchen went quiet. Graham looked at the log as if it had changed shape in front of him. A notebook could be dismissed. An old woman's memory could be questioned. But dates, photos, and soil notes were harder to laugh away. After Calvin left, Mabel stood at the window and watched the gray SUV disappear down the county road. Earl did not leave with him. He stayed behind with Graham near the barn, their heads close, their voices low. Mabel could not hear them. She did not need to. She went to the back door and locked it, in the middle of the day. Then she gathered Arthur's copied pages, her field log, and the first photos of the damaged corner. She drove to the county library in Fulton with both hands tight on the steering wheel. The librarian, Mrs. Bell, remembered Arthur. She did not ask why Mabel needed copies. She only helped. That kind of kindness nearly broke her more than cruelty. Mabel made 3 envelopes, one for herself, one for James Albright, one for the old toolbox in the shed. On the drive home, she kept seeing that black mark on Calvin's map, the same corner, always the same corner. When she returned, the kitchen looked untouched, too untouched. The sugar bowl sat on the table. The field log was where she had left it. The pantry door was closed, but Mabel knew her kitchen. The flour tin had been shifted, not much, barely an inch. But older women notice small things because small things are often all anyone leaves behind. She opened the pantry slowly. The jars were still lined up, peaches, green beans, tomato sauce. Behind them sat the flour tin. Mabel pulled it forward. The lid was crooked. Her heart began to pound. Inside, Arthur's notebook was still there. For one breath, relief almost weakened her knees. Then she saw the strip of paper tucked inside the cover. Not Arthur's handwriting, not James's. Block letters. Pressed hard into the paper, Mabel unfolded it. 3 words stared back at her. "Stop digging, Mabel." She stood frozen in the pantry doorway. Then she heard a floorboard creak behind her. Not from the old house settling, from weight. Someone was still inside. Mabel did not sleep much that night. The words from the note pressed against her mind. "Stop digging, Mabel." Not Arthur, not James. Someone else. Someone watching. She thought of the east field, the saplings, the corner post. All 340 fragile beginnings she had planted herself under the watchful eyes of men who had laughed at her. Sunlight seeped through the blinds. Dust motes danced like memories in the kitchen air. Mabel tied her gray hair back and pulled on her gloves. The field awaited. She stepped outside. The morning was crisp. Moisture from the previous night made the soil dark and rich. But her eyes went straight to the corner post. The flagged section James had told her to document. She knelt and pressed her fingers against the wet soil. The earth had been disturbed again, not by wind, not by rain. Footprints, small, deliberate. Mabel's heart skipped. Someone had been here. Her mind went over the names she had seen so far. Earl, Graham, Calvin. Anyone could have come back quietly. But the prints led only toward the old fence line and stopped. She crouched, eyes narrowing. Something glimmered. A small metal tag buried halfway in the mud. James Albright. She froze. This was no accident. Her pulse raced. Someone was marking her progress, watching the saplings, tracking her notes. Mabel stood. She glanced at the rest of the field. Rows of saplings swayed lightly in the wind, and she realized just how vulnerable they were. One storm, one careless step, one misjudgment, and all Arthur had planned could collapse. She thought of the notebook in the pantry, the original, safe, for now. Then she remembered the note again. Stop digging, Mabel. Was it warning her, threatening her, or testing her resolve? Mabel's hand tightened around the wooden stake she carried. She pressed it into the soil beside the first row. Each stake, each tree, each small mark she made now mattered more than ever. She moved along the damaged stretch, documenting every leaning sapling, photographing the bent stems and partially exposed roots. Each click of her camera felt louder than the rustling leaves. Her phone buzzed, a text of James Albright. "Meet me at the county office. Urgent. Bring all notes and photos." Mabel exhaled slowly and knew she could not wait. She had to finish documenting today. But a shadow flickered at the edge of the field. A truck idled near the road. Earl Rowe's truck. He stepped out. No smile this time. Just eyes scanning, calculating. Mabel felt her breath catch. 340 saplings. Her labor. Her husband's plan. And now someone wanted to see how she had done it. Earl walked closer to the flagged corner. Each step made her fingers tighten on her camera. She crouched behind the nearest sapling, one hand on the mud, one on the lens. Earl paused. He bent slightly, glanced at the soil. Then he straightened, leaving only a faint shadow over the corner post. Mabel exhaled softly, but did not move. She had learned over 3 days of planting. Patience and observation mattered more than confrontation. The wind whispered through the saplings. Her eyes flicked to the pantry door, to the notebook. Safe. For now. She could not take the chance of being seen walking back. She moved silently along the rows, documenting, photographing, taking notes. Every movement had a rhythm, every sapling, every corner post, every stake, a story being written. By midday, she returned to the house. Footprints in the mud told her one thing clearly. Someone had been watching. She looked toward the road. Earl's truck was gone, for now, but she could not shake the feeling of being monitored, and then her phone buzzed again. Another text. "Meet me immediately. Do not bring anyone else." Mabel's heart raced. Her husband had left her a plan. James Albright had confirmed it. But now, someone else was interfering, the one who had left the note. "Stop digging, Mabel." She looked at the east fence line. 340 trees, her labor, her proof. And she knew one thing. This was no longer just about planting. This was about protecting it. Her hands trembled slightly, but she squared her shoulders. She whispered under her breath, "I will not let them take this from me." Then she picked up the notebook copy, her field log, and her camera, and headed toward the county office, because she had to know who had left the warning and why they were watching. Because this was bigger than trees, much bigger, and the answer waited for her at the door. Mabel drove slowly toward the county office. The road was narrow, lined with oak and maple, leaves turning golden in the late Missouri autumn. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, tight. Her thumb brushed the copied notebook pages, the field log, the photos of the corner post. She could feel the weight of them, more than paper, proof, Arthur's plan, her labor. She parked at the back entrance. No one was outside. The office seemed quiet, too quiet. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and ink. James Albright was there. He looked up from a clipboard. Not surprised, not worried, but attentive, exactly the way Mabel remembered from the field. "Mrs. Rowe," he said softly, "come in." She stepped inside. The door clicked behind her. Her boots echoed in the quiet hallway. She could feel the air shift. Something in James's posture told her this was serious, not casual. He gestured to a table. Mabel placed her notes, photos, and copies of the notebook on it. James examined them carefully, every photo, every number, every note about pulled roots and leaning saplings. "Excellent," he said, "not praise exactly, more acknowledgement." Then he looked at her. Earl Rowe. Her breath caught. She had expected his name, but not here, not said aloud. "He's been asking," James said, "about the east line, about the trees, about your documentation." Mabel swallowed. Her pulse quickened. "He's watching?" James nodded slowly. "Careful, calculating. He doesn't want anyone else to see the value of what Arthur planned." Her stomach tightened. The man who had laughed at her fence line, the one who had sneered as she planted each sapling. He had known more than she realized. James pointed toward the photos of the corner post. "Here," he said, "this is the critical point. Your field log proves the damage. The photos show the storm impact, the stakes, the saplings, the repaired soil, all evidence that this is not wasted land." Mabel leaned in. She traced the photo with her finger, the same orange flag James had placed, the corner post, the weak stretch, everything lined up perfectly. James pulled a folder from a drawer. Inside were maps, soil reports, and measurements. Some pages were old, yellowed, Arthur's handwriting still visible. Others were typed, new, clearly prepared for someone reviewing the property. "They call it dead land," James said quietly. "Earl wants them to call it dead. That's the point. If it looks worthless, it can be undervalued, bought cheaply, controlled before the trees restore the soil." Mabel's fingers tightened around the notebook copy. "So he's trying to take advantage before the work even proves itself." James nodded. "Exactly. He underestimated you. He assumed the trees would fail, that the documentation would be sloppy, that you would not understand the value of careful observation." Her mind drifted back to the planting, the 340 saplings, the 3 days of wind, rain, laughter, blisters, and mud. Everything felt alive again, not fragile, not sentimental, purposeful. James tapped a page. "This section here, the corner post, if properly documented, it proves the system works. Soil will retain moisture. Roots will stabilize the edge. Windbreak benefits will show in crop yield. You will be able to defend the property and its value." Objectively, Mabel exhaled. Her chest lifted slightly. Arthur's plan, her hands, proof in every photo, every log. The invisible work now had weight. Then James leaned closer. His eyes flicked to the doorway. "Listen carefully." He lowered his voice. "Earl is not acting alone. There's someone else watching this field. Someone from the county office. Someone who could make trouble if they see this value before you are ready. Mabel froze. The notebook pressed against her chest felt heavier. The log, the photos, every sapling suddenly more precious. James placed his hand gently over one page. You need to keep the originals safe. Don't let anyone see them until the right moment. Not Earl. Not anyone. She nodded. Her hands were shaking, but she felt ready. Then James looked at her seriously. One more thing. He hesitated, paused, then said quietly, "Someone left you a note at home. Stop digging, Mabel. They know what you've started." Her eyes widened. The words came back to her from the pantry, the ones she had almost ignored. James leaned back. "Now you understand. It's not just about the trees. It's about who controls the story of the land." Mabel exhaled slowly. Her eyes drifted to the window. The east field stretched out, bathed in early sunlight. The saplings swayed, the corner posts stood firm, and in that moment she realized the battle had just begun. The hands that planted the trees would have to protect them. Her heart pounded. Her fingers clenched around the notebook copy. She whispered to herself, "They don't know who they're dealing with." And as she left the office, she glanced back. James's eyes followed her, calm, steady, knowing more than anyone else. Outside, a cold wind swept across the east field, a reminder, a challenge, a warning. And someone was still watching. Mabel knew it. Mabel did not drive straight home from the county office. She pulled into the gravel lot behind a small diner outside Fulton and sat there with both hands on the steering wheel. The engine ticked softly. The notebook copies rested on the passenger seat. James's warning stayed with her. Someone else is watching. That was the trouble with quiet danger. It did not always come through a broken lock or a raised voice. Sometimes it came as a smile, a polite offer, a son saying he was only worried, a cousin leaning on a gate like he had nothing to hide. Mabel looked at her hands. The blister across her palm had started to dry. The skin around it was rough and red. 3 days of planting had marked her body in places nobody cared to see. But now those marks felt different, not like wounds, like proof she had not imagined the work. She drove home slower than usual. When the farmhouse came into view, Graham's truck was already there. So was Lena's car and Earl's brown pickup. For one moment, Mabel stayed in the driveway and stared. No one had called. No one had asked. They had gathered at her house again, as if her home had become a room they could enter whenever the story stopped going their way. This time, they were not standing outside. They were on the porch, waiting, and none of them looked angry. That was what made Mabel grip the steering wheel tighter. Graham came down the steps first. He smiled before she opened the door. "Mom," he said, "we need to start over." Mabel stepped out of the car. The wind moved across the yard, carrying the smell of damp leaves and turned soil. "Start over from where?" she asked. Graham's smile held, but his eyes moved once toward the passenger seat, toward the papers. Lena walked down behind him, holding a casserole dish covered in foil. "I made supper," she said softly. "We thought maybe we could sit together tonight." Mabel looked at the dish, then at her daughter's face. Lena looked tired, not false exactly, but not free either. Earl remained on the porch, one hand resting on the railing. He did not smile as wide as Graham. He had learned, maybe, that smiling too much gave him away. Graham stepped closer. "I talked to Calvin again," he said, "and I think we all got off wrong." Mabel closed the car door. "We?" He nodded. "All of us, you, me, Earl, even Calvin. Nobody wants to force anything." Mabel said nothing. That was not the same as believing him. Graham continued, "If these trees matter this much to you, then maybe we should find a way to include them in the plan." There it was, not mockery, not yet control. Something softer, something more dangerous. Include them. Mabel looked toward the east field. The saplings were visible from the yard now, a thin, broken line along the fence, still small, still fragile, but no longer invisible. "What plan?" she asked. Graham glanced toward Earl, only briefly. But Mabel had become a student of brief looks. "A family partnership," Graham said. "Nothing dramatic, just a way to protect everyone." Lena looked down at the casserole dish. Mabel noticed. "Everyone," Mabel repeated. Graham's voice warmed. "Mom, if this land is going to become something more valuable later, we should keep it together, on paper, as a family, later. Not worthless anymore. Not sticks, not bad dirt. Later, Mabel felt something cold and steady settle inside her. They had stopped laughing because the shape of the story had changed. But they had not changed with it. They had only changed their approach. Earl finally spoke from the porch. Arthur always wanted this place to stay with the Rowes. Mabel looked at him. Arthur also wanted people to tell the truth. Earl's jaw shifted. Graham lifted both hands, trying to calm the room before it became a fight. That's exactly why we should handle this properly. If you sign anything alone, outsiders can take advantage. Mabel almost smiled. Outsiders. James was an outsider now. Diana Mercer would be an outsider when she came. Anyone who saw value before Graham controlled it would become an outsider. Lena stepped forward. "Mom, maybe we can at least talk inside." Mabel looked at her daughter. There was guilt in Lena's eyes. But guilt was not the same as courage. "Did you know they came here while I was gone?" Mabel asked. Lena's face changed. Graham answered too quickly. "Nobody came here." Mabel looked at him, then at Earl, then back to Lena. "I did not ask if anyone came. I asked if she knew." Silence moved across the porch. Lena's hands tightened around the casserole dish. "I saw Earl's truck," she said quietly, "earlier. I thought he was with Graham." Graham turned toward her. "Lena," but the word came too late. Mabel heard what she needed. Earl had come back before the family meeting, before the smiles, before the supper, before the partnership idea. She walked around the car and opened the passenger door. She gathered the envelope of copies and held it against her side. Graham watched the papers. His smile disappeared for the first time. "What did James tell you?" he asked. Mabel closed the door. Enough. The same word she had used before. But this time it did not come from fear. It came from restraint. Earl stepped down from the porch. "Mabel, be careful who you trust." She looked at him. "I am." The wind shifted. From the east line, one of the small orange flags flickered near the corner post. Graham followed her gaze. Then he said something careful, too careful. "If James starts filing reports on this field, it could complicate the sale." Mabel turned back to him. "There is no sale. For now," Graham said. That was the first honest thing he had said all day. Not no sale, for now. Lena whispered. "Graham, stop." He ignored her. "Mom, you don't understand how fast opportunities disappear. Calvin won't wait forever." Mabel stepped toward the porch. "No, but the trees will." Nobody spoke. For the first time, even Earl looked away. Mabel walked past them and opened her front door. Before she stepped inside, Graham said one last thing. "We're only trying to protect what Dad left." Mabel paused. Her hand stayed on the doorknob. Then she turned. "Then you should have listened when it was only dirt." The words were quiet, but they landed harder than shouting. Inside the house, she locked the door behind her. Not because she was afraid of them, because she was done giving them easy access to rooms they had not earned. She placed the copied envelope in the pantry. Then she reached for the flour tin. Arthur's original notebook was still there. The warning note was still inside the cover. "Stop digging, Mabel." She stared at the words for a long moment. Then a new sound came from outside, not the porch, not the driveway, the east field, a sharp crack, like wood splitting. Mabel turned toward the window. At first she saw nothing. Then headlights moved slowly along the fence line, not on the road. Inside the field, her breath caught. One of the orange flags disappeared beneath the tires, and as the vehicle rolled toward the corner post, Mabel realized the smiles had only been a distraction, because someone was already trying to destroy the proof. Mabel ran to the window. The headlights glared against the early evening mist. The vehicle rolled slowly along the east fence line. Orange flags quivered with every movement of the tires. Her heart thumped. The corner post, the small section James had flagged, the damaged stretch where the first two saplings had nearly pulled free. Someone was inside her field, watching, testing, trying to erase the proof she had fought for. She grabbed her boots and coat, the notebook copies, the field log, everything she had documented, every photograph, every note. Outside, the tires stopped near the flagged corner. A door opened. Someone stepped out. It was hard to tell from the distance. Tall, broad-shouldered, but familiar enough to make Mabel's chest tighten. She moved carefully across the yard, avoiding broken sod and puddles. The person bent toward the ground. Mabel squinted. Earl. He was crouched near the flag, hands brushing the soil, the small metal stake in his grip. Mabel swallowed. Her lips barely moved. "I know what you're doing?" Earl looked up slowly. "No," he said quietly. "You don't." She took another step. The grass pressed against her boots. The wind tugged at her coat. The saplings swayed like anxious witnesses. Earl straightened. His eyes scanned the field. Then he glanced toward the farmhouse. Inside, the porch light glowed. He paused. A shadow moved past the window. Her son, Graham. Earl's mouth tightened. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, letting him see. Mabel realized the truth. Earl hadn't come to remove flags or break stakes. He had come to see what Graham knew, what her family now understood about the field. Her pulse quickened. Each second felt stretched. The faint smell of wet soil filled her nose. The saplings whispered with the wind. She stepped closer. "Earl," she called softly. "Leave it." He froze. Then he smiled, not kindly, not mocking. Just a thin, measured line. "You still don't know what you've started, Mabel." Her hands clenched the field log tighter. She could feel each page pressing into her palms, proof, evidence, hours of work and patience. "Then you'll see," she said, "every bit of it." He did not answer. He only turned and walked back toward his truck. The engine roared to life. Headlights disappeared into the evening mist. Mabel exhaled. Her knees felt weak, but she stayed where she was. The corner post still stood. The stakes still held the saplings upright. She knew the danger was not over. It had only escalated. Earl had tested her, watched her, measured what she would do next. She glanced at the orange flags. Each one marked months of observation, care, and proof. Each one told a story of patience, persistence, and vision. And now she had to protect it. From him. From anyone who would try to rewrite the story of the land. Her mind raced. James Albright's words echoed. "Don't let anyone see the originals until the right moment." She ran inside, grabbed the notebook copies, the field log, and her camera. Locked the door behind her. The porch light cast long shadows across the floorboards. Mabel stood in the kitchen, breathing hard. She pressed the notebook copies to her chest. The weight of them was heavy. Not because they were paper, because they were proof. Her eyes drifted to the window. The east field stretched out, the corner post, the flagged section, the fragile, swaying saplings. She whispered to herself, "I will not let this be taken." Then a quiet realization settled over her. The battle was no longer about planting. It was about vigilance, strategy, timing, and patience, because the ones who had laughed at her, the ones who had mocked her work, they would return. And this time, they might come with more than words. Mabel's hand hovered over the notebook. She opened it slowly. Pages filled with Arthur's careful sketches, field measurements, tree placements, the line about James Albright. Her fingers traced the corner post again, the exact spot Earl had come to inspect, the saplings that had survived the storm. The evidence of her labor, she exused slowly and whispered aloud, "They still don't believe me." Outside, the wind moved through the east field. A warning, a reminder, a challenge, and Mabel Rowe knew the next move would define everything. The next morning, Mabel did not wait for someone else to make the first move. She rose before sunrise. She made coffee. Then she placed 3 things on the kitchen table: Arthur's notebook, her field log, and the brown envelope from the county library. For a long moment she only looked at them: paper, ink, dates, photographs, small things. But small things had become the strongest wall around her farm. Outside, the east field was still gray with morning fog. The saplings stood along the fence line, thin and quiet. Some leaned. Some had been restaked. Some looked almost too fragile to matter. But they were still there. That was enough. Mabel packed the original notebook into Arthur's old metal lunchbox. She wrapped it in a flour sack and set it beneath the passenger seat of her car. Not in the pantry, not in the house. Not where anyone could reach it while pretending to bring supper or check on her. Then she drove to the county office. James Albright was waiting by the back door. He looked older in the morning light, but steady. The kind of steady that did not need to announce itself. "You brought it?" he asked. Mabel nodded. "Original?" "Yes." James did not touch the lunchbox until she placed it on the table and opened it herself, if that mattered to her. He waited for permission. Then he read, slowly, page by page, Arthur's measurements, Arthur's sketches, Arthur's notes about wind direction, soil loss, moisture near the center rows, and the failing edge by the old corner post. Then James reached the page Mabel had found after the storm. "If Earl asks, say nothing." He stopped. His jaw tightened. Mabel watched him turn the next page. There Arthur had drawn the east field with 2 marks. One where the soil had been failing, the other near the old road access behind the fence. James looked up. "Did anyone mention the access strip to you?" Mabel frowned. "What access strip?" James sat back. For the first time since she had met him, he looked genuinely troubled. Arthur found an old farm access recorded decades ago. It runs behind the East Line. Most people forgot it existed. Mabel felt her hands go cold. Why would that matter? James tapped the page because land with weak production is one thing. Land with a hidden access route is another. Mabel stared at the map. The field seemed to shift in her mind. Not just trees, not just soil. A road. A way in. A way to divide what Arthur had tried to protect. James lowered his voice. If a buyer discounts the field as damaged, then later claims the access makes it more useful, someone profits twice. Mabel did not speak. Arthur had known, not all of it maybe, but enough. Enough to leave warnings in hard pencil and torn paper. Before James could say more, the front office door opened. Voices carried down the hallway. Graham's, then Earl's, then another woman's voice Mabel did not recognize. James closed the notebook at once, put it away. Mabel slid it back into the lunchbox just as Graham appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw her. Then he looked at James, then the lunchbox. "Mom," he said carefully, "why are you here?" Mabel stood. "I could ask you the same." Earl stepped in behind him. His eyes went straight to the metal lunchbox. Not Mabel, not James, the lunchbox. That told her everything. Then the woman entered. She wore a dark green coat, carried a leather folder, and had the calm face of someone used to rooms going quiet when she arrived. James turned to Mabel. "Mrs. Rowe, this is Diana Mercer." Mabel remembered the name from James's warning, the buyer. The one who might see the trees not as grief but as value. Diana offered her hand. "I represent the regional farm co-op James contacted," she said. "We've been reviewing windbreak-supported acreage for small farm supply contracts." Graham's expression changed. Earl's face lost color. Mabel took Diana's hand. Diana looked toward the window, toward the East Line beyond the office parking lot. "Your field documentation is unusually strong," she said, "especially for early restoration." Mabel almost laughed, not because it was funny, because 3 days ago, those same records had been treated like an old woman's hobby. Now someone with a leather folder was calling them strong. Diana opened her folder. "We can't finalize anything today. But based on the photographs, the planting record, and Mr. Albright's site notes, the co-op is prepared to issue a letter of interest." Graham stepped forward. "A letter for what?" Diana looked at him politely. "For a future supply and stewardship review, pending survival rates and field progress." Earl recovered first. "This is family property," he said. "Any agreement should involve the family." Mabel turned to him. "No," the word was quiet, but the room heard it. Graham looked wounded, or tried to. "Mom, this affects all of us." "No," Mabel said. "It affects land your father trusted me to protect." Diana glanced between them. "Mrs. Rowe, for the letter to proceed, we need clear authority from the property owner." Earl opened his mouth. Mabel opened the lunchbox. She took out the deed copy she had placed beneath Arthur's notebook. Her name, Arthur's name, and after Arthur's death, hers alone. She placed it on the table. "My authority is clear." The room went still. Graham stared at the paper as if he had never seen his mother's name before. Maybe he had seen it. Maybe he had just never believed it mattered. Diana slid a document across the table. "It only acknowledges interest," she said. "It does not sell or transfer land." Mabel picked up the pen. Her fingers trembled once, only once. Then she signed Mabel Rowe. Not Arthur's widow. Not Graham's mother. Not Earl's problem. Her own name. When she finished, she laid the pen down. Diana took the paper and slipped it into her folder. Then she paused. "There is one concern," she said. Mabel looked up. Diana's eyes moved to James, then back to Mabel. "We pulled preliminary public records this morning. Someone filed a notice yesterday claiming there may be a boundary dispute along your East Line." Earl did not move. Graham did not breathe. Mabel looked from one man to the other. Then Diana said the words that made the room turn cold. The notice was filed under the name Arthur Rowe. For one long second, no one in the county office spoke. The name sat there in the room. Arthur Rowe, not whispered now, not hidden in Arthur's notebook, not tucked behind careful smiles or family concern, filed, recorded, public. Mabel looked at Earl. He looked older than he had at the fence line. Smaller too, though he had not moved an inch. James Albright stood beside the table, his face set and quiet. Diana Mercer kept her folder open. Graham stared at the notice like it had reached across the room and struck him. "Earl," Graham said slowly, "what did you do?" Earl's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Mabel felt no victory in that silence, only a tired sadness, because she finally understood something Arthur must have known before he died. Some people did not steal by breaking doors. They waited. They watched weakness. They named it opportunity. Then they called it business. Earl cleared his throat. That line was never settled clean. James looked at him. It was settled in 1984. Earl's eyes flicked to him. James opened another folder. Arthur brought me the access record years ago. He knew someone might try to use it once the East Field looked weak enough. Mabel turned toward James. You kept it? James nodded. Arthur asked me to keep a copy. Mabel's throat tightened. Arthur had been gone, but he had not left her unarmed. Diana placed one page on the table. The co-op cannot move forward with active boundary pressure, she said. But if this claim is cleared, Mrs. Rowe's documentation strengthens her position. Mabel looked at the deed, her name, her land, her trees, her proof. Then she looked at Graham. He could not meet her eyes. For years he had seen the farm as weight, debt, repairs. A thing to unload before it buried them all. But now for the first time he saw what his mother had seen. Not a dying field. A field someone had been waiting to take cheaply. Mom, he whispered. I didn't know. Mabel believed that part. But not all ignorance is innocent. Sometimes people do not know because knowing would force them to stand somewhere uncomfortable. She picked up Arthur's notebook and held it against her chest. You knew enough to doubt me, she said. Graham looked down. That was the closest he came to answering. The boundary claim did not disappear that day. Real life rarely gives clean endings by sunset. It took letters, records, old maps, James's copy, Arthur's notes, Mabel's photographs, the field log with dates, rain, damage, repairs, and survival counts. It took 3 weeks before Earl's claim folded under the weight of things he had hoped no one would keep. By then, the saplings had begun to settle into the soil. Not all survived. Mabel lost 23 before winter. She wrote down everyone. She replanted in spring, no speech, no drama, just holes in the ground and hands that refused to quit. The next year, the east field changed quietly. The soil near the corner did not blow as easily. The outer rows held moisture a little longer. Grass returned first, then clover, then the corn along the edge stopped looking thin and ashamed. By the third year, trucks no longer slowed to laugh. They slowed to look. Vern Halper was the first neighbor to ask what trees she had used. He stood by the fence with his hat in both hands. Mabel told him, not proudly, plainly. Because land teaches better when a person stops pretending they already know everything. Lena came more often after that, at first with food, then with work gloves. One Saturday she helped Mabel replace 2 dead saplings near the corner post. She cried once, quietly, when Mabel showed her Arthur's sketch. I should have listened sooner, Lena said. Mabel pressed soil around a young root. Yes, she said. Then after a moment, but you're listening now. Graham took longer. Pride is a stubborn crop. It grows even in poor soil. But one evening in the 4th year, he came to the east line alone. Mabel was standing near the old corner post, looking down the living row of trees. They were taller now, still young, still bending in wind, but no longer fragile enough to be dismissed. Graham stood beside her without speaking. After a while, he said, Dad really planned this. Mabel looked down the line. Your father planned it. Then she placed one hand on the nearest trunk. But I planted it. Graham's eyes filled. He nodded once, not enough to fix everything, but enough to begin. That fall, Diana Mercer returned with the co-op letter. This time there was no boundary claim, no hidden pressure. No family partnership slipped between pages, only Mabel's name, her documentation, her signature. The contract did not make her rich overnight. It did something better. It kept the farm working. It protected the east line. It turned Arthur's unfinished warning into a living future. On the morning she signed the final papers, Mabel did not wear anything special, just her faded blue dress, her old cardigan, and the work boots everyone had once laughed at. Afterward, she walked alone to the fence. The wind came across the field, but it did not hit the same way anymore. The young trees caught it first. They shook, they whispered, they held. Mabel stood beneath them and closed her eyes. For the first time in 4 years, the silence did not feel empty. It felt planted. And somewhere in that soft, rustling line, she could almost hear Arthur's voice. Not telling her what to do, not warning her what to fear, just saying what she had needed to know all along. you were never too old to begin again. If Mabel's courage touched you, please like this video and subscribe, because stories like hers remind us that age does not erase wisdom, and quiet people are often carrying the strongest proof. And tell us in the comments, do you think Graham deserved forgiveness after doubting his own mother? Or should Mabel have made him earn her trust much longer?